Can you hear me at the back there?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Right, I'm Laura Cohen from the British Ceramic Confederation. With ceramic manufacturing companies spending up to 30% of their production costs on energy, we have a real challenge ahead of us. So this presentation today is in two parts. It's all about how we can have an internationally competitive ceramics industry in the future. So I'm going to talk about policy challenge, and Andrew's going to talk about how the ceramics industry can respond. On the policy challenge, I'm going to cover 4 areas. Firstly, I'm going to explain that we have challenging emission reduction targets in Europe and the UK. Secondly, on the policy challenge, we have very unclear industrial strategies, energy strategies, and the role of ceramics. Thirdly, all this leads to enormous cumulative climate-related challenges around costs that really affect, potentially, if we don't get this right, our competitiveness. And finally, we've got a particular challenge for ceramics and heavy clay in particular around decarbonising a high temperature industry. So, a little more on each of those. The first area. Now, to many of you, this graph may be familiar. We have got some really challenging emission reduction targets in Europe and the UK. This graph is from DG Climate Action, which is the department in Brussels, the part of the European Commission that is similar to our Department of Energy and Climate Change. And what they're looking to do is reduce emissions to 20% of 1990 levels by 2050. They're concerned that current policy will only take them to a 60% reduction. They believe this is necessary to mitigate the effects of climate change. And if you look at the coloured bands, you'll see that industry will bear a large chunk of that. The ETS traded sectors are being asked to have an 83 to 87% emissions reduction target, whereas some other sectors, such as agriculture, bear proportionately less. So that in itself, at a high level, presents a challenge because a lot of our legislation comes from Europe. But to compound that, in the UK was the first country to put binding national legislation in to definitely reduce our emissions to 20% of 1990 levels by 2050. And moreover, if you look at the bottom left there, what the European Commission is advocating is an efficient pathway, they believe, that takes a slower trajectory initially, whereas the UK has committed to halving emissions reductions by 2023 to 27. So the UK is taking a very fast and furious approach to this. So we have got these challenging emission reduction targets in the Europe and the UK. The second challenge is industrial strategies. And how does ceramic fit into that? Now, certainly in the UK, there is very limited resource to support manufacturing industry. So government is coming up with strategies to focus on winners and winning sectors. And there is relatively little emphasis on ceramics and the construction sector. There's a little bit on construction. In Europe, the strategy is still emerging. In the UK, there is a policy framework for energy-intensive industries that has been promised for a couple of years and still hasn't appeared yet. We also, I believe, are lacking in a joined-up energy strategy that really does ensure energy security in a low-carbon way at an affordable price that ensures we can compete. Also, ceramics is actually, compared with, say, the chemical sector or the food sector, quite a small and a very diverse sector. As you know, we've got everything in ceramics, from bricks to technical ceramics, to refractories, to tableware. So the policymakers don't really understand it in as much detail as other sectors. And it's quite easy if departments of energy and climate change are commissioning a report to consultants who perhaps don't know the sector well, and there isn't that much published about it, for them to say, oh, there's no evidence of any risk of losing jobs from the UK, or there's no published evidence, or there's little published evidence that the ceramic industry could adapt and develop new technologies. There just hasn't been a lot published. So that has led us at our European level in Ceramic, we're going to be publishing a roadmap to 2050 next week to help flesh out some of these details. So I've explained that we have some high-level emissions challenges in Europe and the UK. It's unclear about the industrial strategy in Europe and the UK, and we're quite small as a sector, so we're not necessarily on people's radar, on policymakers' radar. What this has led to is that we have got some real challenges for the ceramic industry around the cumulative cost to businesses that is climate change related. So I'm just going to talk you through a few slides, and you may well see some of these slides in other presentations later today, and that's because speakers are reinforcing these messages that we really need this to hit home. The UK, what's called baseload electricity price is rising. Now this graph is actually commissioned by Treasury a couple of years ago when the UK was first thinking about putting in a carbon price floor. And what that shows is the baseload price, they believe, whatever scenario you look at, may well almost double by 2030 in real terms compared with 2010 levels. But that baseload doesn't make up all your electricity bill. It's only the black part of the bill. There is a whole series of other taxes and charges coming on into people's bills. Now this is just one of our members' views, but this has been borne out by what a whole range of our members are saying. They've talked to their supplier and produced this graph. And you can see various extra taxes and charges. So for example, from 2013, there's this enormous light blue chunk that appears, the carbon price floor, the UK charge, and the Ofgem chief executive has described this as a Scooby snack of all these extra charges coming in. It really is horrendous, and don't forget that black part of the curve is rising too. Now, over the summer, the business department produced a study from an independent consultant showing that the UK electricity bills for energy-intensive industries already relatively high. The UK is the graph on the right. They compared this with a number of competitor economies. But even more worrying, again, the UK is the graph on the right, the future impact of climate policies on industrial power prices, so what you're actually paying on your bills, is becoming more challenging in the UK for energy-intensive industries. But we don't use, the heavy clay industry uses some electricity but uses a lot of gas. So yes, you've got this almost doubling of electricity bills probably by 2020, but there are other climate change policies affecting your business too. Many of you, particularly in the brick, roof tile, clay pipe industry, wall and floor tile sector, will be coming into EU ETS, some of you for the first time. And it's great that the UK government has developed a small emitter scheme, which is rigorous on climate change and easier on administration, but it's still a cost for you. And some of you will know the fun we had getting carbon leakage status for the heavy clay industry, which we were successful in doing last year, but it's only for 2 years. We've got to go back to the European Commission, who are doing a review of that, and they will make a decision for 2015 as to whether that continues or not. So there is uncertainty around this, and that's potentially an enormous increase in tax if we don't retain that status. Also in the UK, we have climate change agreements. Tough new targets were proposed, and challenging negotiations are continuing. And I think one of our other speakers, Matt Newton, may talk a little bit about that. But at least the climate change agreement does mean if you comply with these very strict targets, you will get some rebate on your taxes. But if you can't meet the targets, you're going to have to buy carbon to do that. There is also uncertainty around the review of the carbon reduction commitment legislation, and that may bring in more companies to that. So it is this cumulative cost of all policies, of all these prices on UK bills, and therefore ceramic industry's business models. So I've talked about the high-level emissions challenges, industrial challenges, and what that actually means on your bills, on your bottom line. We've got a further challenge in ceramics. We are decarbonising a high-temperature industry. Now, if we were the paper sector or aluminium sector, most of our emissions would come from indirect emissions from the electricity we're using in the process. We're not. At CeramUni, we've looked at how the industry generates CO2 for the bricks, roof tiles, refractories, wall and floor tile sectors, which make over 90% of the European ceramic emissions. Now, as you know, we use about 85% of the energy on our plants is from gas as a whole in the ceramics industry. So the challenge is that big red chunk is all the fuel that you're using. So we've got to find a way, if we're going to meet these high-level targets from Europe and the UK, of reducing that red chunk. The blue chunk as well is something called process emissions from the carbonates and so on in the clay. And it is really an accident of geology or geography what clay your factory is using. It really doesn't make sense to truck enormous amounts of clay across the country or across Europe. That is not environmentally the right solution. So we've got two particular challenges. So to sum up, we've talked about high-level environmental and industrial policy challenges and the particular challenge around our industry. And I know that sounds rather grim, so I'm going to hand over to Andrew now to talk about how industry can respond.
Okay, good morning everybody. Andrew McDermott from the British Ceramic Confederation. So Laura has just outlined the size and scale of the policy challenge. It really is an enormous beast to get your head around. So what on earth can we do about it? I'm going to explain things we can do on two fronts. First of all, what you as individual companies can do, but then secondly, what we can do as a sector, so combining together and fighting this as a group rather than as a disparate team of individuals. So looking at the company-specific side of things first, looking at the supply and demand side of your energy use, the first thing is to absolutely negotiate the best possible deal that you can get with your energy supplier. If your gas prices or electricity prices are too high, you're already starting with one hand tied behind your back. You need to get those costs down as low as you can. You need to negotiate hard on those things. And the Major Energy Users Council have got some good courses which will give you the necessary tools to equip yourself for those negotiations and managing energy contracts properly. It's also essential to have a good dialogue with your supplier to understand the costs, the risks you may face as a result of that, and how all this is going to change over the next number of years. Laura earlier presented one member's views, but that is just one member's views. The base load cost is rising, the energy and climate change related taxes and other charges are also rising. So we need to understand that breakdown and how that's going to change over the next number of years. It's definitely a case of being forewarned is forearmed. There's also options for self-sufficiency in terms of a proportion of the electricity which you use. Could you generate some of that on site? You know, is it having a wind turbine on site something that's potentially viable? Is using something like combined heat and power, because obviously in ceramics there's a need simultaneously for both heat and power. So maybe that's something that could be interesting to explore. And also to think about demand side management. And this is where the process is stopped, or certainly certain parts of the process may be stopped if energy prices soar. Now I know this is not something that everybody can consider, particularly those with continuous processes, but those with more of a batch type process, this may be something that you can think about is actually stopping certain parts of the process when energy prices just rocket out of control. Secondly is to budget for carbon. Now, as Laura's already mentioned, those in EU ETS are already aware of the need to budget for carbon allowances over and above that's needed from their benchmark free allocation, and top up that with carbon from the carbon market. But also it rolls out much further than that, because all those that are in a climate change agreement, if you don't hit your targets, then there's costs associated with underachievement. And historically, that's been achieved by the UK Emissions Trading Registry, where you bought carbon on a market-based instrument and paid about £1 or £2 per tonne of carbon. In the new CCA phase, which starts next year, that's going to be scrapped and replaced by a buyout mechanism, and that's at a fixed price for carbon, which will start off at £12 per tonne. So that's an order of magnitude higher than what hitherto has been experienced. That's fixed for the first 4 years of the CCA scheme, but is likely to rise at the latter end of the new CCA phase. So it's not just those in EU ETS, it's those in climate change agreements also have to think about carbon and the potential costs of that. And finally, it really goes without saying, is that everybody needs to be as energy efficient as it's technically viable for them to be. That's not just in terms of reducing energy bills, but that's reducing exposure to climate change related taxes that accompany them. Okay, so that's a broad brush overview of what individual companies can do, but what can we do as a sector? So I'll briefly run through 3 points, and that's the implementation of proven technology, the development of new technologies to try and hit those ambitious carbon targets, and also just touch upon the Ceramic UK roadmap that Laura's already briefly mentioned. Okay, so looking at implementing proven technologies, there's already out there some very important energy and carbon abatement technologies. In fact, just looking at some of the stands very briefly already this morning, you can see there's already a number of these approaches covered. We could move to new energy efficient kilns, and just by doing that, you could achieve fuel savings of something in the order of maybe up to 25%. But the costs of that are horrendous, and the paybacks are extremely long. So it's certainly not a panacea. There needs to be retrofit options to go alongside that. Heat recovery is something that's already widely used within the industry, and that's thinking about the air that's used to cool the products during continuous kilns. That's already used for a multitude of uses. It can be fed to the dryers. It can be used in the kiln preheat sections. It can be used to warm the combustion air. It can even be used for space heating in the factory and other facets of the industry. Take that heat and use it to feed the spray dryer. So that's already technology that's well established. And on intermittent kilns as well, although technically viable, there's still options to do that, but the returns are not quite so great, because the temperature of the heat that's recovered obviously varies as a function of the firing cycle. Looking at energy management and process optimization, these are a swathe of techniques which could be applied, which range from quite simple things like increasing the depth of lagging on ductwork, through to more advanced techniques such as improved monitoring and process control. Could reformulate for more efficient firing. That's both in terms of reducing the firing temperature, but in some cases where there's multiple firings, is reformulating to get rid of entire firing cycles. One tableware manufacturer, in association with their raw material supplier, has reduced their carbon emissions by 79% by following this approach. So there's obviously this potential here. I'm not saying it's necessarily you can achieve things as high as that, but there's obviously things that we can nibble into, and potentially is there something with the technology transfer we could investigate here, rolling that out to the heavy clay side of the industry. And finally, combined heat and power. There is a need within ceramics for continuous heat, continuous power. It is a technology that's used quite extensively on the continent, but hasn't received much penetration in the UK, which then kind of nicely brings me on to the next thing that we can look at sector level, is making sure that the policy framework is aligned and pulling in the right direction. That framework needs to promote the uptake of these abatement technologies. Just mentioned combined heat and power. Some of the changes to policy have de-incentivised combined heat and power. The levy exemption certificate from climate change levy has been removed. That's taken away some of the benefits associated with moving to CHP. Thinking about renewable heat incentive, another government scheme. Well, that relates to technologies which involve heat transfer medium, whereas it needs to be rolled out to direct heat applications such as you find in kilns and dryers. That framework needs to be stable because that's essential to underpin investment. And at the moment, a good example of instability is moved by the European Commission to tinker within the ETS scheme to try and drive the carbon price up. All that does is introduce uncertainty into the market. The policy framework needs to be joined up, all needs to be aligned and pulling in the same direction. On the one hand, it could be a great idea, it could make financial sense to implement a wind turbine on site, but then it could run into problems with planning permission. That all needs to be pulling in the same direction. And behind all of this is the need to make sure that any abatement savings are balanced by the needs that we certainly don't have a deindustrialisation. We're not simply moving those energy-intensive processes abroad to less regulated countries. The carbon leakage fight that we've got. And finally, for proven technologies, the availability of capital. Now, something that you may be interested in is the Green Investment Bank. And this is a government scheme whereby they've invested £100 million of seed funding into non-domestic energy efficiency schemes. So there's two fund managers which have been given the job of administering this funding. And we hosted one of these fund managers at our recent Ceramics 2012 event. Now these fund managers are looking at off-balance sheet type finance solutions. So something that could be of interest to anyone that's considering investing in energy efficiency or decarbonisation technologies. Okay, so that's looking at things for the here and now, but looking further ahead, there's a pressing need to develop new technologies. We've already identified as a sector several breakthrough technologies which will be required to help them become more energy efficient and decarbonise. And the first of these is looking at renewable biofuels, whether that's solid fuels, liquid fuels, or gaseous fuels such as syngas and biogas, with syngas being a combustible mixture that you get from gasification of carbonaceous feedstock, or biogas, which is anaerobic digestion of biodegradable feedstock to essentially produce biomethane. So these are the things that we need to be looking at. For those elements, just skip to the last point, is there needs to be availability for these feedstocks. They need to be sustainably sourced, and the feedstocks that we have need to be efficiently used. Now this was all brought home really to me last week when I went around the power station. and then planning to switch over from coal to firing with biomass. And they're already sourcing vast quantities of biomass, and they're sourcing it from faraway shores on contracts which are in place for 10 to 20 years already. So this is something which we need to catch up on. We've got feedstock for these types of bioenergy processes. Thinking about what else we can do, heat recovery. We talked about the cooling air, but the kiln exhaust is also another potential rich source for heat recovery. And the problem with this is it's low temperature and there's acidic gases in there, so it's very near the dew point, so the heat exchangers, traditional heat exchangers, are damaged and corroded very, very quickly. Now, although quite exotic materials are being used to develop durable heat exchangers, they cost the earth, so we need to kind of bridge the gap between the two and have an affordable but durable heat exchanger. And if we could do that, we could recover some of the heat from the kiln exhaust, which could then put to a multitude of good uses. Carbon capture and storage, that's capturing the carbon, transporting it and storing it somewhere, for example in an underground aquifer or a depleted oil or gas reservoir. Now potentially could be a technology which is an answer to the process emissions problem. However, it's probably unlikely that it actually will be because of the relatively small size and the geographically widespread of ceramic sites across the country. It's not the same as in some sectors where they've got a small number of very large emitters located fairly close together. So all of this obviously needs funding in order to bring it from a development phase through to a commercial reality. So we're working very hard at the moment to try and source funds, whether that's at a European or a UK level, because the sorts of funds involved, it's unlikely that an individual company is going to have the funds in order to go it alone, particularly given the difficult financial circumstances that we find ourselves under. Okay, and then finally, Laura's briefly mentioned the ceramic roadmap. This will be publicly launched next week at the European Commission, and basically it covers the potential methods to decarbonise the process. It positions the sector as part of the solution for the transition to a green economy rather than being a problem. And for example, some specific examples of that would be low life cycle carbon footprint products, construction materials used for energy efficient houses, or used for other objects you find within the house and more widely, to long life refractory products, which are absolutely critical in delivering products which require high temperature processing. So I'm not just thinking about ceramics, but much wider than that, steel and glass. And finally, critical components used for electricity generation, usually wind turbines, for transmission, for electricity storage, and components which actually reduce the amount of energy consumption or electricity consumption in use. So basically, position the industry, it says in the bottom there, to become an absolutely critical part of the low carbon, resource efficient economy by 2050. Okay, so that finishes what I want to say. Hand briefly back over to Laura, just to sum up, just to wrap up, and then we'll field any questions that you may have.
Thanks, Andrew. Really, just to sum up, we've outlined the policy challenge because of these very tough emissions reduction targets, the need to shape an industrial policy, the cumulative cost, and that we needed desperately in this industry to produce a roadmap, as other sectors are starting to do, to respond to these challenges so we can start to have a better dialogue with policy formers in the UK and Europe and outline some of the ways in which we can respond to these challenges. Andrew's outlined what individual companies can do, but also, really importantly, what we have to try and do as an industry to help try and keep you in business. With energy being up to 30% of your bills, you don't need to be told that you need to be energy efficient. The challenge is we need to explain this to policymakers and about the role that your products can play in helping Europe and the UK meet their targets. So, Are there any questions?
No, thank you. Okay, the gentleman at the back there.
On negotiating your energy bill, you say about negotiating with your suppliers. Are there still opportunities to negotiate energy supplied by the generators, which are totally two different things?
What's the good,
Well, the suppliers can be any old parasite, which we've all dealt with in the past. And whereas the generators, the benefit that the ceramic industry has is a continuous base load, which certainly the coal generating power stations love to have, so they know where the power is going. So it should give you a better price.
yes, yeah, I'm not 100% sure on that, but from what I experience I do have, is that certainly some of the energy generators that we've talked to, they have their separate kind of trading companies, so they become suppliers to the supplier, who then supplies you. So I'm not aware of any generators that sell direct. They tend to work through a supply company which they control.
Anti-competitive, why don't you use that at that point?
I think we've got to be aware that we are up against countries like France, where they have, for example, an Exceltium contract with stable, low electricity prices from nuclear. That sort of thing is just not available in the UK, and through the Energy Intensive Users Group we are trying to get that sort of framework in place, so in return for these enormous subsidies that we as users are providing, we can get something more acceptable as contracts. I think we're a long way off getting that, but certainly it is important that companies, ceramic manufacturers, do try and look at the range of options out there, perhaps being part of a consortium, to try and negotiate what's right for them. Okay, are there any more questions? And it would be helpful if you could say your name and organisation as well.
Laura, Mark Chapman from Ibstock Brick. Without going into the politics of all this, it seems to me that the UK has put itself up on an almost unachievable pedestal in comparison with the rest of Europe. Surely isn't one of the jobs of British industry to actually reprogram our government, if there's an opportunity to do that, so that they actually look at what's happening across the rest of Europe and actually bring things onto a more level playing field for us, because it seems to me that, particularly with the electricity generation graph, that because they are apparently intent on shutting down coal-fired power stations in the next sort of 10 years, that is almost unachievable.
I couldn't agree more with you, Mike. This is what we are trying to do, and we're very pleased that the business department commissioned this independent report to show that there isn't this level playing field. And recognising that we are up against things like the French Exceltium contract, but also in Germany, energy intensive companies that are large users of electricity there can get a very considerable rebate. I think it's well over 90% of their green taxes. Now the government's aware of this. They've come up with a package of measures for electro-intensive industries. It's £250 million over this spending review, but it is tiny, and it's been constructed in such a way that it doesn't really benefit the ceramic sector at all. So yes, this is part of our bread and butter. I'm giving evidence to a select committee on this in a couple of weeks' time, which is chaired by one of the MPs who has ceramic constituency interests. So we are trying to use every avenue possible to ensure that we do have more of a level playing field. It is not easy, so that's why we need help from our members in getting their MPs onto site and MEPs to explain the issues and explain how this is affecting your business and your competitiveness. And we are happy, if we can, to try and come along and help in that influence process. So for example, tomorrow Andrew is visiting a brick factory with a new MEP who's very keen and enthusiastic about the ceramic industry. These are the sort of people we need to influence and get on side. This is a Lib Dem MEP, so he's really important given that we've got a Lib Dem Secretary of State in both the business and the department and the Department of Energy and Climate Change. We know Ibstock's been great about this sort of approach, and many companies in this room have been good too, but we need to do more of this.
Okay, just one other point that I'd add to that is even where you think that the playing field should be more level, for example in the EU ETS scheme, different states transpose the directive in a slightly different fashion. So even within that measure, which should hit all manufacturers equally, certainly across Europe, then differences do exist. So we need to work at those. An example being process emissions. In some countries they're discarded, in other countries they're included, and that has a massive implication on the carbon emissions that are generated.
One area where the UK could do a lot more is in recycling of some of these green taxes. The intention behind the EU ETS was that national governments would recycle some of these tax receipts into developing some adaptation technologies, decarbonisation technologies. The UK is not spending as much as they could, and the strategy they're adopting isn't really benefiting the ceramics industry. Some of the R&D money is going into things like developing offshore wind and so on, and they've also, from their technology needs assessment, have picked 4 sectors, which are chemicals, cement, food and drink, and steel, and just going to focus the resources on those. Now that doesn't help us, and there may be some knock-on effect from some of the technologies, but we really do need to start having a better dialogue in the UK and Europe about what is needed in order that we can survive, develop, thrive as an industry in this environment.
Okay, I'm going to have to sort of break